Sign these papers right now, Daniel, because I am not spending another second pretending a lazy, zero-ambition Hausvasen like you is my equal. I filed for divorce 3 weeks ago. You have no ambition, no career of your own. I won't pretend anymore.
Sign these papers right now, Daniel, because I am not spending another second pretending a lazy, zero-ambition house husband like you is my equal. Victoria's voice did not just rattle the microphone. It cut through the chatter of 300 people and turned the entire grand ballroom of the Bellevue Imperial Hotel into a tomb. I stood on the stage, looking directly at my wife of 25 years. She looked beautiful in her silver designer dress, but her face was completely cold. There was no hesitation in her eyes. She reached into her expensive clutch bag, pulled out a thick envelope containing the divorce papers, and threw them onto the podium right next to the microphone. Around us, the crowd was dead silent. These were Seattle's wealthiest people, real estate moguls, tech founders, and the entire board of directors of Vanguard Holdings, the multi-million-dollar family empire founded by Victoria's grandfather. For years, these people had looked down on me. To them, I was just Daniel Brooks, the lucky guy who hit the jackpot by marrying a rich heiress. They knew me as the husband who stayed at home, cooked the meals, took care of the estate, and managed the household chores while Victoria ran the family empire. I was the invisible man in their world, a useless house husband who lived off his wife's hard work. Just a few minutes ago, I was standing near the stage, preparing to give a speech I had spent weeks writing. I wanted to thank Victoria for 25 years of marriage, and to talk about the early years when we had nothing but a tiny, drafty apartment and a pile of student debt. I had a massive bouquet of red Juliet roses in my hands, ready to present to her. But when the master of ceremonies called us up to celebrate our silver anniversary, Victoria walked past me, took the microphone, and delivered the blow. "I filed for divorce 3 weeks ago," Victoria continued, her voice sounding incredibly clear through the high-end sound system. She looked out at the audience, then back at me, making sure everyone could hear every single word. "I have spent the last quarter of a century carrying the weight of this entire family on my shoulders. While I was working 80 hours a week to build Vanguard Holdings into a powerhouse, my husband was content to stay at home, do some gardening, and spend my money. I can no longer tie myself to a man who has absolutely no drive, no ambition, and no career. It is over." A low murmur broke out among the guests. I looked toward the front tables. Our 23-year-old daughter, Sarah, had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Beside her, our 21-year-old son, Leo, stood up from his chair, his face red with anger and confusion. He looked at his mother, then at me, but the security guards near the stage silently stepped in to prevent him from coming up. At the VIP table, Victoria's mother, Eleanor, sat back in her chair with a smug smile on her face. She nodded slowly, approving of her daughter's public execution of my dignity. They all thought I would break down. They expected me to beg, to argue, or to make a scene. That is what they wanted, to see the poor, useless husband crawl on his knees to save his comfortable life. But I didn't do any of that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let my hands shake. I simply looked at Victoria, noting how easily she could discard 25 years of history just to put on a show for her wealthy peers. She wanted to humiliate me, to completely crush my spirit in front of the world. "Okay," I said quietly, speaking directly into the silence. I walked over to the podium, gently set the expensive bouquet of red roses down on the polished wood, and placed my unsent speech right next to her divorce papers. I didn't touch the envelope. I didn't look at her again. I turned around and walked off the stage, My steps were steady and calm. I could feel hundreds of eyes drilling into my back, the whispers rising like a wave behind me. But for the first time in 25 years, I felt incredibly light. I walked out of the double mahogany doors of the ballroom, leaving the noise and the rumors behind. The long, carpeted hotel hallway was empty and quiet. I walked past the gold-framed mirrors and the expensive art pieces until I reached the glass doors leading to the hotel's terrace. The cool night air of Seattle hit my face, along with a light, steady rain. I pulled my personal, encrypted black phone out of my tuxedo pocket. This wasn't the phone my family knew about. This was a private line. I pressed the only speed dial contact on the screen. It rang only once before a calm, professional voice answered. "Daniel." "Start the final phase," I said. My voice was entirely flat, devoid of anger or sadness. It was just business now. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of fingers tapping rapidly on a computer keyboard. "It is finally time," Marcus, my private asset attorney, replied. "I have been waiting for this call for 2 years. I will begin the unwinding process immediately." "Thank you, Marcus. Keep me updated on the timeline," I said, and hung up the phone. I stood there on the terrace, watching the rain run down the glass doors. Victoria believed she had just freed herself from a parasite. She believed she was stepping into a bright, ambitious new future, fully backed by her family's $80 million fortune. She thought she was the one holding all the power, all the money, and all the cards. She had absolutely no idea that she had just signed the death warrant for her family's entire empire. She had no idea that for the last 18 years, every single investment, every real estate deal, every stock portfolio, and every major financial move Vanguard Holdings made was completely designed and controlled by me. I was the one who kept them afloat. I was the one who grew their wealth while they took all the credit. And now I was walking away. By the time Victoria and her arrogant family realized what they had actually lost, it would be too late. The entire $80 million house of cards was about to come crashing down, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. I sat in the back of my plain black sedan as the driver pulled away from the Bellevue Imperial Hotel. Outside, the Seattle rain was hitting the windshield in steady, heavy sheets. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't look like a man who had just been publicly humiliated and divorced in front of 300 people. I looked like a man who had finally finished a long, exhausting shift. To understand how we got to that stage tonight, you have to go back 2 years. 2 years ago, our house in Medina was quiet, but the silence was different. It was the kind of silence that comes from cold, unspoken contempt. By then, everyone in Victoria's family had fully accepted the narrative that I was a useless house husband. My daily routine was simple and visible to everyone. I woke up at 5 in the morning, made black coffee, prepared breakfast for Victoria and the kids, and drove Sarah and Leo to their private schools. I vacuumed the carpets, managed the landscapers, sorted the mail, and made sure the dinner was hot and ready on the table by 7. To Victoria, her mother Eleanor, and her cousins, I was a glorified maid who had hit the lottery. They called me the house husband behind my back, and eventually, right to my face. I remember a family dinner during Thanksgiving 2 years ago. We were sitting around a table that cost more than my first car, eating food I had spent 6 hours preparing. Victoria's cousin, Arthur, looked at me with a smirk and said, "Daniel, this turkey is excellent. It's really a blessing that Vanguard Holdings makes enough money so you can stay home and focus on your true passion, roasting birds." Eleanor, my mother-in-law, let out a soft laugh. "Now, Arthur, don't tease him. Every successful woman needs someone to keep the house clean. Daniel is very good at folding laundry." I didn't get angry. I didn't defend myself. I just took a sip of my water and smiled. Victoria sat right next to me, completely silent. She didn't defend her husband of 23 years. In fact, she looked slightly embarrassed to be sitting next to me. Over the years, as Vanguard Holdings grew bigger and her name appeared in local business magazines, She had slowly started buying into her family's belief. She genuinely believed she was the sole engine behind the family's massive wealth. She forgot where that wealth came from. But the truth was kept inside a small, locked office in our basement. I wasn't always a house husband. 18 years ago, I was a senior financial engineer at one of the top quantitative hedge funds in Chicago. I spent 80 hours a week writing algorithms, analyzing market trends, and structuring complex investment portfolios. I was very good at it, and I was making a lot of money. But then Victoria's father passed away suddenly. He left behind Vanguard Holdings, which at the time was a struggling real estate and manufacturing company. It was suffocating under $40 million of debt, bad investments, and terrible management. Victoria was terrified. Her family was on the verge of losing everything. She came to me in tears, begging me to help. I knew that if I officially joined Vanguard Holdings as the financial director, her arrogant family would constantly interfere, fight over my decisions, and drag the company down anyway. So we made a deal. I resigned from my high-paying job in Chicago, and we moved back to Seattle. Officially, I became a stay-at-home dad to take care of our young children. Unofficially, I took complete control of the family's remaining capital. I set up a private, independent wealth management firm called Apex Horizon Partners. My name was never on the public registration papers. Instead, I used Marcus, my trusted attorney, as the face of the firm. Victoria signed the legal paperwork, giving Apex Horizon full power of attorney to manage Vanguard Holdings' treasury and investment decisions. To the public, the board, and the IRS, Apex Horizon was just an external, elite financial consulting firm that Victoria had hired. In reality, Apex Horizon was just me, sitting in my basement office after the kids went to bed. For 18 years, I worked in the dark, while Victoria went to business galas, gave interviews, and took credit for the genius restructuring of Vanguard Holdings. I was the one pulling the strings. I built a proprietary algorithm that automatically traded index options to hedge the company's real estate risks. I scouted under-the-radar commercial properties in Seattle right before the tech boom hit, buying them cheap through shell companies and folding them into the Vanguard portfolio. I took their failing $15 million inheritance, stripped away the toxic assets, and turned it into an $80 million empire. Every single major financial move that made Victoria look like a corporate genius was designed, calculated, and executed by me. I did it because I loved her, and because I wanted her to shine without the stress of the financial gears grinding her down. I wanted our kids to have a secure, stable life, free from the chaotic money struggles I grew up with. I was perfectly fine being the ghost in the machine. But gratitude is a fragile thing when ego gets in the way. 2 years ago, our children were in college, and Victoria's coldness turned into active disgust. She stopped asking for my advice. She started staying late at the office, claiming she had urgent board meetings. She stopped looking me in the eye when she came home. At night, she would lie on the opposite side of the bed, her back turned to me, tapping away on her phone. Then came a rainy Tuesday night in late November. It was around 2 in the morning. I woke up to a dry throat and decided to go downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I walked down the carpeted hallway, I noticed a thin line of light shining from the crack under Victoria's home office door. I walked quietly, my bare feet making no sound. I was about to knock and tell her to get some sleep, but then I heard her voice. It was low, but the house was so quiet that her words carried clearly through the door. "No, I haven't told him yet," Victoria whispered. She sounded nervous, but there was an underlying excitement in her voice that I hadn't heard in years. "My mother says we need to be careful with the asset division. Daniel has no money of his own, but since we've been married for over 20 years, a judge might award him a massive chunk of Vanguard Holdings just because he washed my dishes." There was a pause as she listened to the person on the other end of the line. "I know," Victoria replied, her voice turning cold and sharp. "It makes me sick to think he could walk away with millions of dollars he did absolutely nothing to earn. Don't worry, the lawyers at Vance and Associates are already drafting the paperwork. We are going to isolate all the major investment accounts under a new structure before I serve him. He won't get a single dime of my family's fortune. I'm going to strip him of everything." I stood there in the dark hallway, holding my empty glass. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. The woman I had protected, the family estate I had saved from bankruptcy 3 times, the fortune I had built from scratch. They were planning to throw me out like garbage, completely convinced that I was a parasite. But as I stood there listening to my wife plot my ruin, my eyes drifted to the small brass key in my pocket. It was the key to my basement office, where the master servers of Apex Horizon Partners were humming quietly in the dark. Victoria was planning to divorce me and take all her money. What she didn't know was that the money she thought was hers didn't actually exist without me. And she was about to find out exactly what happens when the ghost finally leaves the machine. The basement of our Medina home was always cold. It smelled like old paper, dry concrete, and the stale black coffee I kept in a heavy ceramic mug on my desk. While Victoria hosted charity dinners upstairs, I spent my evenings in this small, windowless room. It didn't look like much, just a metal desk, a cheap office chair, and a rack of servers humming quietly in the corner. But this room was the actual brain of the Vanguard family empire. For 18 years, the Vanguards did not make a single direct investment. When Victoria's father died, the family's business was a mess of bad debts and crumbling properties. I was the one who quietly swept up the debris. I set up Apex Horizon Partners, a private, independent wealth management firm. My name never appeared on a single public document. I let Marcus, my attorney, act as the sole registered agent. To the public and the Vanguard board, Apex Horizon was a highly exclusive, external financial consulting firm. In reality, every stock trade, every commercial property acquisition in downtown Seattle, and every venture capital allocation was executed by me, sitting at this desk. Victoria never understood the financial plumbing of her own company. She didn't know how to read a balance sheet beyond the high-level color-coded summaries I printed out and left on her kitchen counter. She believed the rise in Vanguard's net worth from $15 million to $80 million was due to her strategic vision and corporate leadership. I was perfectly fine letting her believe that. I wanted her to succeed, and I wanted my children to have a secure future. But 6 months before our 25-year anniversary, the pattern changed. Victoria began asking detailed questions about Vanguard's liquid cash reserves. One evening, as I was washing the dinner dishes, she came into the kitchen, holding her laptop. Her voice was unusually sharp. "Daniel," she said, leaning against the marble countertop, "I need you to compile a full schedule of our liquid assets managed by Apex Horizon. I also want to know the penalty fees for liquidating our treasury bond portfolio early." I stopped scrubbing the pan. I didn't turn around immediately. I let the warm water run over my hands, thinking. A treasury bond portfolio is the absolute anchor of a company's financial safety. You don't liquidate it unless you are facing a massive crisis, or unless you are planning to spend a very large sum of money very quickly. "We have about $42 million in highly liquid treasuries," I said, turning off the faucet and wiping my hands on a towel. "The penalty for early withdrawal would cost us about $300,000. Why do you ask?" "It's just business," she snapped, looking down at her screen. "Vanguard needs to be more aggressive. Our current investment strategy is too conservative. We are leaving millions on the table because we are playing it safe. I'm looking into a new fund that promises much higher yields." "Conservative is what kept Vanguard alive during the 2008 crash," I said quietly. Victoria let out a short, mocking laugh. "That was 20 years ago, Daniel. The market has changed. But I don't expect you to understand that. You've been sitting in this house for so long, you've forgotten how the real world works. Just get me the documents by tomorrow morning." She walked out of the kitchen, her high heels clicking loudly on the hardwood floor. I stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment. I didn't get angry. I just went down to the basement, booted up my secure server, and began checking the system logs. Victoria had already accessed the Apex Horizon client portal 3 times that week, downloading detailed reports on our commercial real estate equity. Since I managed our home's local network, a simple task to ensure our family's digital security, I decided to check the router logs. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Victoria had been spending hours on encrypted messaging apps late at night. More importantly, she had been exchanging frequent emails with a personal email address registered under the name Julian Vance. I didn't recognize the name, so I opened a secure browser and started digging. Julian Vance was all over social media. On Instagram and LinkedIn, he was a self-proclaimed disruptive financial wizard and the founder of Vance & Associates Wealth Management. His profiles were filled with photos of him wearing a gold Audemars Piguet watch, boarding a private jet, or leaning against a matte black Lamborghini in Miami. He posted short, high-energy videos explaining how traditional investing is dead and how his private fund guaranteed a 30% annual return through high-frequency crypto arbitrage and leveraged tech options. To an average investor, Julian looked like a financial god. To me, a man who had engineered complex mathematical trading models in Chicago for years, his public statements were an absolute joke. His white papers were filled with meaningless financial buzzwords, and his claimed returns violated the basic laws of market, liquidity. I decided to run a deep, professional background check through my private channels. Within 48 hours, Marcus sent me a secure PDF. The reality was exactly what I expected, but worse. Julian Vance was not a licensed fund manager. He had been barred by the SEC 5 years ago for running an unregistered investment scheme in California. The matte black Lamborghini was leased under a shell company that was currently 3 months behind on payments. The private jet photos were taken at a stationary hangar in Burbank, where people paid by the hour to take pictures inside empty planes. His wealth management firm was a classic Ponzi scheme, surviving solely on fresh capital brought in by wealthy, gullible socialites. And Victoria was one of them. As I scrolled through the digital trail, I found something that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just financial. There were reservation receipts for boutique hotels in Bellevue, booked under Victoria's personal credit card. There were emails filled with intimate messages, where Victoria complained about her boring, deadweight husband and praised Julian for showing her what a real, ambitious partner looked like. I sat in the blue light of my computer monitors, the silence of the basement wrapping around me. I felt a cold, hard stone settle in my stomach. The woman I had protected, the family I had built, the business I had saved from total bankruptcy, she was sleeping with a low-level con artist, planning to throw me out and hand him the keys to the family fortune. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A normal man would have stormed upstairs, thrown the hotel receipts in her face, and demanded an explanation. A normal man would have screamed, cried, or filed for an emergency court injunction to freeze the assets. But I wasn't a normal man. I was a financial engineer, and in my line of work, you never react to a market anomaly with emotion. You analyze the trend, you calculate the risk, and you position yourself to profit from the inevitable crash. I remembered a basic rule I had learned during my first year in Chicago. A man who builds a house knows exactly which nail to pull to bring the entire structure down. If I confronted Victoria now, she would only deny it, hide her assets deeper, and rush the divorce through an aggressive lawyer. Her family would rally around her, using their public relations machine to paint me as a bitter, unstable husband. They would find a way to lock me out of the system before I was ready. No, I would not say a word. I would let her believe she was the smartest person in the room. Over the next 3 months, I quietly began my own preparation. Every single night, while Victoria slept upstairs, I sat in my cold basement office and gathered evidence. I downloaded 18 years of tax returns, bank statements, asset transfer authorizations, and emails. I made digital copies of every single trade Apex Horizon had executed for Vanguard Holdings, proving that I was the sole manager of the capital. I saved every hotel bill, every message, and every piece of financial fraud Julian Vance had committed. I organized everything into a secure, encrypted drive, labeled simply, Project Unwind. Then, one evening, 2 weeks before our anniversary, I logged into the Master Apex Horizon portal to perform a routine security sweep. I clicked on the pending transaction folder and froze. There was a new document waiting for my administrative signature. It was an asset transfer authorization, drafted by Victoria's new lawyers at Vance & Associates. It authorized the immediate transfer of the entire $42 million Vanguard Treasury bond portfolio out of Apex Horizon and into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, managed directly by Julian Vance's private firm. She was preparing to hand the entire family fortune to a thief, and she needed my invisible signature to do it. I looked at the screen, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The trap was set, and she was walking right into it. I leaned back in my chair, picked up my cold mug of black coffee, and took a slow sip. I stared at the blinking cursor on my computer screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses in the dark basement. The transfer request for $42 million of Vanguard's liquid treasury bonds was sitting in the pending folder, waiting for my master administrative signature. I didn't click approve, and I didn't click deny. I just leaned back in my cheap office chair, took a slow breath, and looked at the dossier on Julian Vance that Marcus had sent me. Julian Vance was not a financial genius, nor was he a licensed fund manager. He was a predator who hunted in the shallow waters of social media. On Instagram, he had over 500,000 followers, post after post showing him posing with rented Lamborghinis, wearing $50,000 Audemars Piguet watches, and sitting in the first-class cabins of commercial flights. He called himself a disruptive wealth architect and ran a firm called Vance & Associates. He targeted wealthy, insecure people who wanted to feel smart, powerful, and modern. He promised them 30% annual returns through what he called leveraged multi-asset arbitrage trading. But when you stripped away the financial buzzwords and the glossy photos, Julian Vance was running a classic, low-level Ponzi scheme. His firm was bleeding cash, and his personal bank accounts were completely overdrawn. He was using the money from new investors to pay off the interest of older ones, while using the rest to fund his fake, high-rolling lifestyle. The SEC had already barred him from managing public securities 5 years ago under his real name, but he had simply moved to Washington, changed his legal name, and opened a new unregistered private fund to bypass the regulations. He was desperate. His pyramid scheme was on the verge of collapsing because 3 of his major investors had recently demanded their capital back. He needed a massive injection of cash to keep himself out of federal prison, and that was when he met my wife, Victoria, at a real estate charity gala. To Victoria, Julian was everything I was not. He was loud, flashy, and constantly showered her with the kind of intense, aggressive praise she hadn't received in years. He told her she was a corporate queen, a visionary who was being dragged down by a lazy, unambitious husband who stayed at home and did nothing but fold laundry. He made her feel young, exciting, and powerful, and she fell for it, completely and utterly. As I read through their personal emails and text messages that I had retrieved from our home network logs, I felt a deep, cold silence inside me. She was sleeping with him in boutique hotels across Bellevue while I was at home cooking her dinners. She was sharing Vanguard's private financial data with him, completely blind to the fact that he was slowly, carefully skinning her alive. A normal man would have snapped. He would have walked upstairs, shown her the SEC filings, and exposed Julian as a fraud. He would have screamed at her for betraying 25 years of marriage. But I knew exactly what would happen if I did that. Victoria's massive ego would never allow her to admit she had been fooled by a con artist. If I confronted her, she would immediately call Julian, and he would tell her that I was just a jealous, pathetic, controlling husband who was trying to sabotage her happiness and her business. She would have hired the most aggressive divorce lawyers, frozen our joint accounts, and rushed the asset transfer anyway, leaving me in a messy, years-long legal battle. So I decided to do nothing. I decided to let her have exactly what she wanted. I would not protect her from her own arrogance. In my years of engineering complex financial models, I learned that the most effective way to deal with a bad investment is not to try and fix it when it is already toxic. You simply hedge your position, pull your own capital out, and let the market liquidate the rest. I spent the next several weeks quietly preparing my exit. Every night, while Victoria was asleep or pretending to work late at her office, I sat in my cold basement and built Project Unwind. I downloaded 18 years of complete financial records, tax returns, and asset purchase agreements. I compiled every single document showing that I, through Apex Horizon Partners, had been the sole manager and creator of the family's $80 million wealth. I kept copies of every communication between Victoria and Julian, proving her intent to bypass our investment protocols and transfer corporate funds to an unlicensed, fraudulent entity. I wasn't trying to steal their money. I didn't want a single penny of the Vanguard fortune. I only wanted to protect my personal assets, my own independent investments, and the trust funds I had set up for our children, Sarah and Leo. I quietly restructured the kids' college funds and personal trusts, moving them into airtight, independent accounts that Victoria's family could never touch, even with a court order. I also began the process of liquidating my own private shares in the commercial real estate projects I had personally funded and managed over the years, transferring my personal wealth into a secure, private account under my own name. By the time I was done, my personal finances were completely separated from the Vanguard empire. I was a ghost preparing to vanish from the machine, leaving behind a hollow shell that they thought was solid gold. I looked back at the $42 million transfer request on my monitor. It was a massive amount of liquid cash, nearly the entire treasury reserve of Vanguard Holdings. If this money left our accounts, Vanguard would have no safety net left. They would be completely exposed to any market downturn, and they would have zero liquidity to pay their operating expenses or commercial mortgages. I took my mouse, hovered the cursor over the admin approval button, and clicked it. The system processed the signature, and the $42 million was authorized to be moved. I didn't feel any regret. I felt nothing at all. But as I was about to close the portal and shut down my computer for the night, a new alert flashed on my screen. It was a secondary, urgent notification from the Vanguard corporate bank account. I opened it, and my breath caught in my throat. Julian Vance hadn't just convinced Victoria to transfer the $42 million of liquid treasury bonds. According to the newly uploaded board resolution documents, which had been signed by Victoria and her mother Eleanor behind my back, she had just authorized the immediate sale of nearly all our safe, long-term commercial real estate assets in downtown Seattle. They were liquidating the very foundation of the family's wealth, preparing to dump another $30 million of hard assets into Julian's fake fund. They weren't just stepping into a trap. They were actively building their own gallows, and they were about to pull the lever. The conference room of Vance & Associates was located on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper in downtown Seattle. It was a cold, sterile room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray, rain-soaked city. A massive, polished quartz table sat in the center, surrounded by expensive leather chairs. The air smelled of brand-new carpet, leather, and the heavy cologne of Victoria's high-priced attorney, a man named Richard Sterling. Victoria sat across from me, wearing a sharp, navy blue business suit. Her mother, Eleanor, sat next to her, her arms crossed over her chest, looking at me as if I were a stain on her expensive silk blouse. Beside them sat Julian Vance. He was wearing a tailored, gray suit, his gold Audemars Piguet watch catching the bright overhead LED lights as he leaned back, tapping a gold pen against his notepad. He had a smug, victorious smile on his face. I sat alone on my side of the table. I didn't bring a lawyer. I didn't even bring a briefcase. I just had a cheap black pen in my jacket pocket. "We expected you to bring legal representation, Daniel," Richard Sterling said, spreading a thick stack of documents across the court's table. "This is a highly complex asset division. Without a lawyer, you are at a severe disadvantage." "I don't need a lawyer," I said flatly. "I just want to get this over with. Show me where to sign." Victoria let out a soft, irritated sigh. "Daniel, please don't start playing the victim now. We are offering you a very generous settlement. You get the Medina house, though you will have to take over the remaining mortgage payments, and a lump sum of $500,000. In exchange, you will sign these papers waiving any and all claims to Vanguard Holdings, its subsidiaries, its future earnings, and all family trust accounts." She paused, looking at me to see if I would flinch. She expected me to beg for more. She expected me to argue that the Medina house was heavily leveraged, or that $500,000 was a joke compared to her family's $80 million fortune. "I understand," I said, pulling the cheap black pen from my pocket. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, pointing his gold pen at a specific document in the stack, "you must sign this administrative release form. It officially terminates the advisory agreement between Vanguard Holdings and Apex Horizon Partners. Victoria is moving all treasury assets under the direct management of Vance and Associates, effective immediately." Julian smiled wider, leaning forward. "We just want to streamline the transition, Daniel. Under my firm's management, Vanguard's assets will finally grow at a pace they deserve. We don't need a conservative, outdated external firm holding us back anymore." I looked at Julian, then at Victoria. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Julian's Vance and Associates was a sinking ship, a Ponzi scheme running on fumes. If Victoria transferred Vanguard's $42 million in liquid treasuries and liquidated their Seattle real estate to buy into his fraudulent fund, they would lose every single dollar within 6 months. The entire $80 million empire her grandfather built would be completely vaporized. I could have stopped it. I could have thrown Marcus's background check on the table and exposed Julian right there. I could have saved the family estate. But as I looked at Victoria's cold, arrogant face and her mother's smug sneer, I realized they didn't deserve to be saved. They had spent years treating me like a parasite, completely blind to the fact that I was the only thing keeping them alive. They wanted to jump off the cliff because a flashy man in a nice suit told them they could fly. So I reached for the documents. "Daniel, are you sure you don't want to read them first?" Victoria asked, her voice filled with a sudden, slight suspicion. She was unsettled by how easy this was. She had prepared herself for a massive, bloody court battle, and instead I was just sitting there with a cheap pen. "I've spent 25 years reading your documents, Victoria," I said, my voice completely steady. "I don't need to read another one." I pulled the papers toward me and began to sign. I signed the divorce papers. I signed the asset waiver. I signed the release of the Medina house. And finally, I signed the document terminating Vanguard's relationship with Apex Horizon Partners. I didn't hesitate for a single second. My hand didn't shake. The only sound in the silent conference room was the scratch of my cheap pen against the heavy bond paper. When I was finished, I pushed the stack back across the polished table. Eleanor let out a sharp, triumphant breath. Julian chuckled softly and pulled the papers toward him, checking my signatures with greedy eyes. Victoria stared at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. She looked victorious, but she also looked deeply uncomfortable. She couldn't understand why a man who was losing everything was acting so calm. "Is that all?" I asked, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "Yes, Daniel, that's all," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The lawyers will file these with the court today. The divorce will be finalized by tomorrow morning." "Good luck, Victoria," I said. I didn't shake anyone's hand. I didn't look at Julian or Eleanor. I turned around, opened the heavy glass door of the conference room, and walked out. That night, I went back to the Medina house. It was a massive 6-bedroom estate overlooking Lake Washington, but it felt completely empty now. Sarah and Leo were away at their respective universities, and Victoria had already moved into a luxury penthouse suite downtown. I packed my things. I didn't take any of the expensive furniture, the art, or the silver. I only packed 2 suitcases of my personal clothes, my books, and my private financial records. At midnight, I went down to my basement office for the very last time. The server rack in the corner was glowing with tiny, green lights, humming quietly in the dark. I sat at my metal desk, booted up my administrative laptop, and logged into the master Apex Horizon database. I had already moved my personal wealth and our children's independent trust funds into secure, untraceable accounts weeks ago. Everything was safe. Now, there was only one thing left to do. I opened my email client. I drafted a message to Victoria, her mother Eleanor, the entire board of directors of Vanguard Holdings, and their primary corporate bank. I kept the email short and entirely professional. I attached the signed termination, agreement, and the administrative release documents. In the body of the email, I wrote, "Effective at 8 a.m. tomorrow, Apex Horizon Partners will officially cease all asset management, risk hedging, and treasury services for Vanguard Holdings. All proprietary trading algorithms, automated hedging scripts, and financial oversight systems have been permanently deactivated. Full administrative control of all accounts has been transferred to Vance and Associates." I hovered my mouse over the subject line and typed 2 words, "Resignation accepted." I looked at the email for a moment. With this one message, I was pulling the plug on the life support system of Vanguard Holdings. The automated algorithms that bought and sold options to protect their commercial real estate from market crashes were gone. The daily cash flow balancing systems that kept their operational accounts out of overdraft were shut down. The complex, highly customized financial shield I had spent 18 years building was now completely dead. They had the money. They had the accounts. But they had absolutely no idea how to run the machine. I clicked send. I shut down my laptop, placed it into my leather bag, and stood up. I walked over to the server rack, reached behind the metal frame, and flipped the master power switch. One by one, the green lights went dark. The quiet hum that had filled this basement for nearly 2 decades faded into a heavy, absolute silence. I picked up my suitcases, walked up the stairs, and locked the basement door behind me. I walked out of the house, threw my bags into the trunk of my car, and drove away into the dark Seattle rain. Tomorrow morning, Victoria would wake up believing she was finally free, rich, and in complete control of her family's future. She had no idea that she was sitting in a plane that had just lost both its engines, and the only pilot who knew how to land it had just jumped out with the only parachute. It had been exactly 3 months since I walked out of the Bellevue Imperial Hotel and turned off the server rack in my Medina basement. I was now living in a small, rented cottage on Bainbridge Island, drinking a simple cup of hot black coffee. The house was quiet, smelling of old pine wood and salty sea air from the window. I didn't need a mansion anymore. My personal funds, which I had legally and carefully separated from the Vanguard estate before the divorce, were more than enough to let me live comfortably for the rest of my life. I watched the morning ferry glide through the gray waters of Puget Sound, leaving a long, white trail of foam behind it. The silence in the house was beautiful, but over in downtown Seattle, the storm was finally hitting. It had started slowly. In the first month after the divorce, Victoria and Julian were riding high on their illusion of absolute victory. According to the local business papers, Vanguard Holdings had announced a major strategic realignment under its new investment director, Julian Vance. They bragged to the media about liquidating their underperforming commercial real estate assets in downtown Seattle to fund high-yield, modern digital portfolios. They were selling off the rock-solid foundations I had spent 18 years acquiring, trading them for promises of 30% annual returns from a flashy social media star. To a normal observer, it looked like bold leadership. To me, it was like watching a child trade a brick house for a shiny red balloon. Without my automated trading algorithms running in the background, Vanguard's remaining real estate portfolio was completely unprotected. The Seattle commercial market took a sudden, sharp downturn in the second month. Interest rates spiked, and several major tech tenants in their buildings declined to renew their leases. Under my management, Apex Horizon's automated hedging options would have immediately triggered, offsetting the rental losses and keeping the company's cash flow stable. But those servers were sitting dark and dead in my old Medina basement. There was no shield. The rental income plummeted, and Vanguard had to pay their massive monthly mortgage payments out of pocket. But that was just a minor leak. The real explosion came from Julian Vance. 2 weeks ago, Julian's Ponzi scheme finally hit the inevitable brick wall. A group of wealthy tech investors in California, who had been trying to withdraw their $20 million capital from Vance and Associates for 6 months, filed a formal complaint with the SEC. The federal regulators moved fast. They froze all of Julian's domestic bank accounts, only to find them completely empty. Julian knew the game was over. He didn't wait around for the FBI to knock on his door. The night before the freeze went active, he packed his designer bags, drained every single dollar he could access from the Vanguard corporate accounts, and boarded a flight to a non-extradition country in South America. He took everything. He took the $42 million of liquid treasury reserves that Victoria had transferred to him. He took the $30 million from the quick sale of the downtown commercial real estate. In total, Julian Vance disappeared with over $72 million of the Vanguard family's money. When Victoria woke up the next morning and tried to log into her Vanguard corporate account to pay their monthly operating expenses, she found a red warning screen. The balance was close to zero. She tried to call Julian. His phone was disconnected. She drove to the offices of Vance and Associates, only to find the building locked, with federal agents taping search warrants to the glass doors. The panic that swept through the Vanguard family was absolute. Eleanor, Victoria's mother, reportedly collapsed in her living room when she realized their entire generational wealth had vanished overnight. The board of directors at Vanguard Holdings called an emergency meeting. They were in complete chaos. The company had 48 hours to pay its commercial mortgages and employee payroll, but they had no liquid cash left. Every single line of credit they had was tied to the real estate assets they had just sold off to Julian. In their desperation, Victoria's lawyers tried to contact Apex Horizon Partners. They wanted to demand that the consulting firm restore their old accounts and activate their cash reserves. They sent urgent, threatening emails to Marcus, my attorney, accusing Apex Horizon of negligence and demanding to speak to the chief investment officer. That was when they found out the truth. Marcus met with Victoria and her legal team in a small meeting room. He didn't bring any financial charts or presentations. He simply slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was the administrative release form Victoria and her mother had signed 3 months ago, along with my printed resignation email. Apex Horizon Partners officially terminated its relationship with Vanguard Holdings at exactly 8 a.m. on the morning of your divorce, Marcus told them, his voice calm and professional. We have no access to your funds. We have no authority to manage your assets. The automated systems were deactivated on that day, as per your signed instructions. Victoria stared at the paper. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. Then who is the chief investment officer of Apex Horizon? We need to speak to him directly. He is the only one who knows how our old accounts were structured. Surely he can help us recover our lost data. Marcus looked at her, his expression completely blank. You know him very well. Victoria, the sole manager, founder, and chief financial architect of Apex Horizon Partners, is your ex-husband, Daniel Brooks. The silence in that room must have been deafening. Victoria's lawyer, Richard Sterling, reportedly dropped his pen. Victoria sat frozen, her mouth slightly open as the puzzle pieces finally fell into place. She realized that the husband she had treated like a useless, lazy maid for 25 years was the actual financial titan who had built her $80 million empire. She realized that the parasite she had publicly humiliated on their anniversary was the only thing that had kept her family from ruin. He didn't take a single dime of her money. He didn't steal their fortune. He had simply packed his bags, signed their papers, shut down his servers, and walked away with his own hard-earned assets. He had left them to face the world alone, exactly as they wanted. I sat by the window of my cottage, watching the rain tap against the glass. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. My black encrypted phone sat on the wooden table next to my coffee. For 3 months, I had received absolutely no communication from the Vanguard family. I had blocked their numbers on my primary phone, but I had kept my old personal line open, just to see when they would finally realize what they had done. Suddenly, the phone on the table began to buzz. I picked it up. The screen lit up with a number I had known by heart for 25 years. It was Victoria. The phone vibrated in my hand, a silent, desperate plea from the other side of the lake. A normal man would have answered to gloat, to laugh, or to tell her, "I told you so," but I didn't feel the need to say anything. Im lang joy kikon lon tieng hon het. I let the phone ring until the screen went dark. Then I put it back on the table and took another slow sip of my coffee. The rain on Bainbridge Island was different from the rain in Seattle. Here it tasted like salt and pine, rolling off the metal roof of my rental cottage in a steady, soothing rhythm. I sat at my wooden dining table, a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of me, watching the gray fog drift over the water. My black encrypted phone buzzed on the table. It was Marcus. "They're completely desperate, Daniel," Marcus said, his voice carrying a dry amusement. "Victoria went to 3 different elite consulting firms in the city yesterday. She even flew in a forensic accounting team from New York. They paid them $50,000 just for a 48-hour emergency audit." "And?" I asked, taking a slow bite of my toast. "And they might as well be trying to read ancient hieroglyphics," Marcus replied. "They managed to turn on your old servers in the basement, but your automated trading system is a total black box. None of the hired financial experts understand the investment structure you built, and absolutely no one can read or run the system. The proprietary quantitative models you wrote, the ones that handle the interest rate swaps and the commercial lease hedging, are completely locked behind your private encryption keys. The New York team told Victoria that trying to force crack the system would trigger an automatic hard wipe of all the remaining databases. They won't touch it." I hung up the phone and set it down. I didn't feel happy about their panic. I just felt a quiet, cold sense of closure. For 18 years, the Vanguards had lived in a fantasy. They believed that managing $80 million of assets was simply a matter of signing colorful papers, attending charity galas, and looking important in front of reporters. They had no idea about the thousands of lines of code I wrote every night to protect their wealth. They didn't understand that when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, my algorithms automatically shifted millions into defensive positions. They didn't understand that when a major tenant defaulted, my system immediately restructured the commercial debt to avoid a margin call. I had built a highly complex, customized financial fortress around them. When I resigned and turned off the servers, I took the keys with me. Now the gates were locked, the drawbridge was down, and the enemy was already inside. From what Marcus told me, the scene at the Vanguard Holdings headquarters was pure chaos. Victoria had spent the last 72 hours locked in the executive boardroom with her lawyers, her board members, and the new team of financial analysts she had hired to replace me. The analysts were young, Ivy League graduates wearing expensive suits, but they were completely out of their depth. They stared at the monitors displaying Vanguard's active portfolios, watching the numbers drop in real time. Without my automated hedging scripts, the sudden drop in the Seattle real estate market was dragging their remaining assets down like anchor stones. Vanguard's debt-to-equity ratio was spiraling out of control. They owed $24 million in short-term loans that were due at the end of the month, but their liquid cash was entirely gone, stolen by Julian Vance. "We can't liquidate any more properties to cover the debt," one of the young analysts told Victoria, his face pale and covered in sweat. "The market is too cold. If we sell now, we'll be selling at a 40% loss. which will trigger immediate defaults on our other commercial mortgages. It's a chain reaction. Then fix the algorithm, Victoria screamed, her voice cracking with exhaustion. She had dark circles under her eyes, her silver dress from 3 months ago, replaced by a wrinkled business suit. Daniel ran this system from a cheap laptop in our basement. How can an entire team of Wall Street experts not understand how to turn it back on? The lead analyst shook his head. Because your ex-husband didn't just build a system, Miss Vanguard. He built a living financial ecosystem. The code is written in a customized language that constantly adapts to daily market movements. Without his master admin key, the system thinks we are hackers trying to steal the data. It has completely locked us out. If we try to bypass it, we lose everything. Victoria sank into her leather chair, her head in her hands. Her corporate lawyer, Richard Sterling, the same man who had smugly handed me the divorce papers 3 months ago, stood near the window. He had been reviewing Vanguard's legal and financial obligations under the new contracts Victoria had signed with Julian Vance. He looked older, his expensive tie loosened, his confidence completely gone. He walked over to the table and looked at Victoria. "Victoria," Sterling said, his voice flat and heavy. "We have run out of options. The banks are not going to extend our credit lines. They know Julian cleared out our treasury. A corporate attorney on our team just analyzed the wreckage and told me directly, the only person who can save the remaining assets is Daniel." Victoria looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and panic. I called him 10 times. He won't answer his phone." "Then you need to find him," Sterling said bluntly. "Because if you don't, Vanguard Holdings will file for bankruptcy by Friday morning. You didn't just lose a husband, Victoria. You started to realize that the person you threw away was the only one holding this entire family together." That evening, Victoria drove out to our old home in Medina. The massive house was dark and completely silent. The landscapers had stopped coming because the bills hadn't been paid, and the grass was growing long and wild. She unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The air inside was cold and smelled of dust. The expensive furniture, the crystal chandeliers, and the marble floors were still there, but the warmth of a home was entirely gone. She walked down the long, empty hallway, her heels echoing loudly in the silence. She reached the door to the basement and opened it. She flipped the light switch, but the bulb had burned out, leaving the stairs in deep shadow. She turned on her phone's flashlight and slowly walked down into my old workspace. The basement office was freezing. The server rack in the corner was dark and silent, its cables hanging loose like dead vines. My metal desk was completely bare, except for a layer of thin dust. Victoria walked over to the desk. She shone her phone light across the scratched metal surface. In the very center of the desk, sitting right where my laptop used to be, was a small, black leather notebook I had left behind. Her heart began to beat rapidly in her chest. Her hand trembled as she reached out and picked it up. She recognized my neat, precise handwriting on the cover. She opened the notebook to the very first page. In the center of the white paper, written in black ink, was a single sentence. "If you are reading this, it means I've gone far enough." Victoria sat on the dusty floor of my old basement office, her phone's flashlight illuminating the yellowed pages of my black leather notebook. Her breath caught in her throat as she began to read. The neat, precise numbers and dates in my handwriting did not contain angry rants or emotional outbursts. Instead, they were a cold, dry record of 25 years of silent sacrifices that she had never known about. On the first few pages, she found the financial logs from 15 years ago. She remembered that year clearly. It was the year Vanguard Holdings almost went bankrupt after a major commercial tenant defaulted on a massive lease, threatening to trigger a chain reaction of bank foreclosures. She had told her friends that she had saved the company through her brilliant negotiation skills. But the notebook revealed a different reality. I had quietly liquidated my own private technology shares that I had accumulated during my years working as a financial engineer in Chicago. I had transferred $5 million of my personal cash into Vanguard's corporate accounts, disguising it as a foreign institutional loan, so her arrogant mother and cousins would never know the truth. She turned the page and found the records from 8 years ago, during the local real estate crash. While Victoria was away at a 3-week wellness retreat in Europe to cope with executive stress, the company had run out of liquid cash to pay its employees. The notebook detailed how I had secretly taken out a personal mortgage on my own inherited family assets to cover the corporate payroll, ensuring that Vanguard's credit rating remained perfect. The third save was logged 5 years ago, when her cousin Arthur made a disastrous, unauthorized $5 million investment in a failing biotech startup. To prevent the board from firing him and publicly disgracing the family, I had used the private trading profits from my independent Apex Horizon accounts to quietly buy out the toxic shares and balance the books. I had saved her family 3 times from absolute financial ruin, and I had never said a single word about it to anyone. But the entry that made Victoria's eyes fill with tears was dated exactly 22 months before our silver anniversary. It was the exact day I discovered her secret messages and hotel reservations with Julian Vance. Underneath the digital logs and screenshots of her messages, I had written a short note. I know everything. I know about the lawyers, the boutique hotels, and her plan to strip me of my dignity before filing for divorce. I could end this today. I could freeze their accounts and expose Julian as an SEC-barred con artist in 5 minutes. But Sarah and Leo are in their final years of university. They need a stable home, a mother who isn't a public disgrace, and a father who doesn't tear their lives apart right before their exams. I will wait. I will keep the financial shield up and protect this family until our children walk across that graduation stage with their degrees in hand. After that, if she wants to leave, I will let her go. Victoria closed the notebook, pressing it against her chest as she sobbed in the dark, empty basement. She realized that the husband she had treated like a useless, lazy maid was the only giant who had been carrying her entire world on his shoulders, and she had personally driven him away. The next day, Victoria tracked me down to a small, quiet coffee shop near the ferry terminal on Bainbridge Island. The afternoon was cold, and a light fog was rolling off the gray water of Puget Sound. I sat at a small wooden table near the window, wearing a simple gray wool sweater, holding a warm mug of black coffee. When she walked in, she looked like a shadow of her former self. Her expensive designer clothes were gone, replaced by a plain coat, and her face was pale, worn out by weeks of sleepless nights and panic. She sat down across from me. I didn't say anything. I just set my coffee down and looked at her. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. I read the notebook. "I figured you would eventually," I said flatly. "Why?" she asked, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Why did you do all of that for us? Why did you save my family 3 times and never tell me? And why did you stay for 2 years after you knew about Julian?" "I did it for the kids, Victoria," I replied, my voice completely calm and even. "I wanted Sarah and Leo to finish their education without carrying the weight of our ruined marriage. And I did it because I once loved you, and I wanted to give you every opportunity to remember who you were before the money changed you." Victoria reached across the cold wooden table, trying to grasp my hand, but I gently pulled it back and placed it in my lap. "Daniel, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "We are losing everything. The banks are foreclosing on Vanguard. The forensic accountants say only you can unlock the proprietary trading system to save our remaining assets. Julian took $72 million and fled. I was stupid. I was blind. Please come back. Help me save the company. We can start over. I will do whatever you want." I looked at her, noting the desperation in her eyes. It was the same desperation her father had 20 years ago, but this time I felt no urge to fix it. "I can't help you, Victoria," I said quietly. "Why?" she cried. "Why won't you help? Why didn't you stop me? If you knew Julian was a fraud from the very beginning, why didn't you just tell me? Why did you let me sign those papers and destroy my life? I looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, a small, cold smile appeared on my face. Because a person who wants to leave doesn't need to be kept. Victoria, I said, if I had shown you the proof back then, your ego wouldn't have let you believe me. You would have thought I was just a jealous, controlling husband trying to stop you from achieving your greatness. You had to build your own gallows, and you had to pull the lever yourself to finally understand the height of your own arrogance. She sat there, completely frozen, her mouth slightly open as my words sunk in. It's over, Victoria, I said. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and left a $5 bill on the table to pay for my coffee. I gave you 25 years of my life. I kept my promise to protect you until the kids were grown. Now, my job is done. I turned around and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her sobbing alone at the table. 2 years later, the dust had finally settled. I was sitting in my spacious, sunlit office on the top floor of a modern building in downtown Seattle. The brass plaque on my door read, Brooks Wealth Management. The firm was incredibly successful, managing over $200 million for select, high-net-worth clients who actually understood the value of conservative, quantitative risk management. I was free, respected, and completely at peace. Vanguard Holdings was gone. The banks had foreclosed on their remaining commercial properties, and the Grand Medina estate had been sold at a public auction to pay off their outstanding debts. Victoria's mother, Eleanor, had to sell her luxury vehicles and move into a retirement home. Julian Vance had been arrested by federal agents in Brazil 6 months ago. He was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and money laundering. Victoria now lived in a small, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Tacoma, working a quiet, low-paying administrative job at a local shipping company. She lived in absolute obscurity, completely forgotten by the wealthy high society circles that had once showered her with fake praise. It was my 55th birthday. I sat at my mahogany desk, looking out at the beautiful blue waters of Elliott Bay. My assistant walked in and set a small stack of mail on my desk. On the very top was a simple white envelope. There was no return address, but I immediately recognized the neat, elegant handwriting. It was from Victoria. I picked up my brass letter opener, sliced the envelope open, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. There was no long apology, no begging, and no demands. It contained only one handwritten sentence. It turns out the richest person in our marriage was never the one with the most money, but the one who knew how to stay silent. I stared at the words for a long moment. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel any desire to write back. I slowly folded the piece of paper, placed it back into the envelope, and slid it into my desk drawer. I stood up, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked out at the endless, open sea. The sun was shining brightly, and a gentle breeze was rustling the sails of the boats in the harbor. I took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air, and I smiled.